Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with .org Community and Adage Technologies. My name is Emily Hendershot, and I serve as .org Community's Managing Director. Today's webinar is with Adage Technologies on how to conduct comprehensive audience research and organize, analyze, and apply your findings.
So to kind of kick us off, when we talk about audience research, I like to start from the why perspective. And why is it important? Why do we take this so seriously? And some of those in attendance may have heard me talk about this before, but the gist of this diagram here is that in our work with associations, we found that there are 5 common high-level challenges kind of across the board. And those are audience understanding, which we're talking about today, content, and more specifically, the massive amounts of content and intellectual property at most associations, searching that content, so mostly the findability of that incredible content, and then personalizing it, which is the second step of findability. And the final challenge is the complexity and the number of technology systems. It's usually at least 4, probably 8 different systems that need to be integrated to give the member the experience that they expect and that they're looking for. But the base level is still audience understanding. So John Locke said that the most important component of being a successful author is understanding who your audience is and what they want. Now, I love this little cartoon that I've got here that illustrates the importance of audience understanding. You see the adults or the client looking at this mobile hanging over the baby in its crib, and they think this thing looks great and they're very happy with themselves. But since they didn't understand the baby or the audience perspective, the baby is just staring at this, which is probably not the purpose of this product and what they intended when they set out to build it. So let's start with who your audience is. Lots of associations look very high level at their audience, so just members and non-members. And we would argue that that's an incomplete assessment of who you're talking to. That group really needs to include more audience segments like employees, staff, stakeholders, to really round out the picture of what the audience looks like for you. So now that we kind of covered who the audience is, we need to understand them. And so we break this down into 4 groups: active, passive, detached, and what we're going to call ghost members. Now, active members are really advocates. They volunteer, they lead or participate in committees and sections, and they usually will give feedback without being prompted. And then there's passive or captured members, and as part of the organization because they kind of have to be there. So they'll attend events, they'll get their certifications, but they're unlikely to engage unless they have some kind of incentive or they're asked to. So the next ones are the detached members, and those are really what we call in the danger zone. They're on the fence about renewing their membership. They're generally disengaged from the organization and don't see value in staying with the association. And that's probably because they're unaware of member benefits. And these members are at a high risk of defect. And then finally, the ghost member, which is interesting because we don't talk about it that often, but they don't even know that they are members. We hear this quite a bit, that they were signed up by someone else, like their company or maybe their school. So they've never actually done research on benefits. They don't obviously understand them, and obviously they don't have any engagement with the organization. So it's really important to get ahead of these potential issues with members instead of being reactionary. Because if you wait for people to complain, they're probably already very upset. And that means they've got one foot out the door, and that's really not what we're looking for. So now, how do we begin to understand the audience? Usually we'll start with data, which associations have insane amounts of. And everyone likes to talk about how great it is. It's usually found in many, many places, like your AMS, your LMS, your community platform, etc. But what are we really doing with it? That's usually the problem that we run into, is that there's so much data, but we're not doing anything with it. So what we advocate for is being data informed and not data driven. And what I mean by that is because if you're strictly data driven, you ignore intuition, storytelling, and emotion of your membership. So where else do we typically find information about our audience? A lot of the times it'll come from the board in a room like this, C-levels, key stakeholders. They often are very set in their ways and their mindsets, and we end up hearing things like, that's how we've always done it, or this is a program that's very important to our members, without much supporting evidence to back that up. And one of these I've got on here is one of my favorites, is we need to be like Amazon, which is an interesting thing for an association to aspire to be, which is great. but there's a lot of differences between the size of Amazon and most membership associations. So now say what you want about Steve Jobs, the person, but this quote is a primary reason why Apple is what it is today. One of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. Before you market or sell anything, that's really where you have to start, and it's understanding your audience and understanding the customer. What it really means is we need to get outside of our bubble. We got to get outside the boardroom, and we have to understand our users. But really, how do we do that? So what we need to do is we look at qualitative and quantitative methods that help us build empathy for our audience. And empathizing is the first pillar of design thinking, which we at Adage are firm believers in. We need to empathize, then define the problems we're facing, ideate, brainstorm, come up with solutions or potential solutions, and then prototype them and test them, and then repeat the cycle over and over until you get things right. And design thinking is really, it's nothing more than creating experiences based on what users want and need. It's not about pushing pixels, it's just giving the best customer experience possible. And so how does audience research fit in with all of this? Really, it comes back to empathizing. Maya Angelou said that people forget what you say or what you did, but they'll never forget how you make them feel, and everyone wants to make their association members feel good. That's what we're here for. So we have to remember that it's all about the user, it's all about the audience. So real quickly, I'll go back to my high-level association challenges diagram, and I want to talk real quickly about how audience research is critical to finding the nuances at your specific organization. We have two clients, and these are real examples. They were both rebuilding their websites, which is just a common goal. It's one of the things that we do all the time. So with client A, we looked at Clickstreams, how users were behaving on the site to gain some information and some insights. We did interviews with members, talked to them, many different members. And then we also talked to customer service, which is a great place to find pain points in your organization. So what we learned was that the user base was not tech savvy at all, and we needed to have a clean, simple design. They were also looking for member benefits quite a bit, and those were not obvious on the current website and the current experience. So one of the things we needed to focus on was an easy navigation. And since we saw the users were seeking out lots of information, we also needed a clear path to conversion. Now, these are three primary goals for this project, and they're unique to this organization that we wouldn't have known without in-depth research and understanding our audience. And then client B is totally different. Did the same kind of things with the interviews. We tried to get an analytical view of the organization, and then we held several stakeholder workshops, amongst other things. And what we learned for this particular organization was that the membership model was super complex, and we needed hyper-personalization to accommodate the numerous member types that they deal with. We also learned that many of their products couldn't be purchased together. So like a course or a book, we needed to find ways to bundle and upsell so that it's easier for the users. And finally, we found that their analytics that we kind of took a deep dive into was so kind of out of whack that we had to completely start from scratch so that we could take advantage of the data that we had. So that's just a quick example of the differences in different associations where we have to dig deeper than the base level or some of the things that we've, some of our biases. So where do we start? We go back to empathizing with our users. And Riju is going to talk about how you can best do that. And I am now going to turn it over to him.
Great. Thank you, Jake. And now I'm going to lead us to dive into the specific audience research method that will help us understand our members, or non-members, a wider audience, and to help us build this understanding by uncovering data and stories to build empathy. So first of all, I want to show you this just a very wide landscape of user research methodologies here. And don't be overwhelmed by the number of the methods here. There are a lot of them. And as we can see, this is a landscape map. However, when it comes to selecting a research method, it really all comes down to what type of data we're trying to gather and what kind of question we're trying to answer. And of course, our budget and timeline of the project are also common constraints as well. And for example, if you look at here, If we want to gather more qualitative data, stories and sentiments, then we can use interviews, usability studies, and those are the two very common approaches here. And if we're looking for large sample and more data-driven outcomes, then A/B testing, surveys might be more appropriate approaches here. And eye tracking usability studies focuses more on understanding users' behavior, while interviews, diary studies, and tree testing can uncover more attitudinal insights. So there are lots of them to choose from, and we won't have time to dive deep into all of them today in our limited time together. What I'd like to do is to take us on a survey or journey across some of the most widely used, effective, and affordable research methods, and we'll discuss in brief the how-tos, when and where and why of each of these methods that we're going to walk through together. So starting with the story piece, so let's talk about the qualitative approach, ones that will help us gain insights into user sentiments and help us tell their story from their perspective. And in this section, we will be covering interviews, diary studies, user feedback, moderated usability studies, and desirability studies. So starting with interviews, you've probably led or participated in interviews before. It's just conversations with somebody, right? Well, it is easy, and there are some truth in that. It is one of the easiest research methods out there, but also can be the hardest. So let's take a look here. So interviews can be conducted with pretty much anybody. So from stakeholders, subject matter experts, current and prospect users, anyone that we were interested in talking to, or we think might have an interesting perspective, they could be an interviewees for our study. These interviews, particularly from a user research perspective, we want it to be more structured, and it's one-to-one session, usually led by a user designer or researcher. The researchers will identify the topic. It could be as specific as new membership pricing model, renewal process, or it could be more general, things like overall feedback of the organization or thoughts on the current website. And interviews are crucial in helping establish a baseline sentiment and understanding around our user goals and pain points at a very early stage of the project. We also always find things that we didn't thought about before we go into these conversations. So in our experience, interviews really help spark new ideas for future ideations. Interviews are relatively low cost, given you have the needed staff expertise to design, schedule, and conduct and synthesize the interviews. When we do interviews at Adage, usually the only piece of equipment required is our phone for recording, and a piece of paper and pen to take notes. And typically we schedule interviews that are 30 minutes to 45 minutes long. It can be done in person or via remote meeting. So, things like a GoToMeeting or other platforms or even a phone call sometimes will suffice. One best practice I want to point out is that for user research type of interviews, we recommend keeping the question open-ended, meaning no yes or no questions. And never should we ask leading questions. For example, how do you feel about our amazing new website? Don't you feel great about being a member? Those are great questions as a conversation starter or just casual conversations, but those will create biases and just kind of blur the perspective that we're trying to get from a member or the interviewee's perspective. You can if you can only do one research, I'd say go talk to your users, current members, prospect members, or even lapsed members, trying to understand what's the reason behind them dropping off. So this is probably the most important user research method that we utilize here at Adage. Another great way to get a fuller picture of our users is through diary study. This is another low investment, high yield research method. It's also fun. So let's take a look. diary studies are most effective when conducted with existing users or prospective users. And the name is pretty self-explanatory, right? So we ask study participants to record and describe aspects of their life that are relevant to our research topics, whether using a tool on the job, doing an exam prep, navigating around a conference, etc., etc. So there are a lot of things we could study using this particular method. And the goal is to gain insights in user behavior in their natural context, which is the most valuable outcomes from this particular method. Another very similar method that will generate similar insights is called field studies, which requires researcher to be there in person to shadow the jobs of the study participant. We won't dive deep into that in this webinar, but if you're interested, feel free to look up just field study, and you will find a lot of information about that particular method. So back to the diary study. To conduct a diary study, first we need to identify the research topic, then define the applicable context of this topic. And then we create instructions and recruit participants. And then we will gather recordings and the diary notes from the participant. And that will help us really get a peek inside the study subject's real life and notice things that they may fail to mention in other methods, say interviews, or other out-of-context research, let's say sometimes like a survey and other method that we might be covering later in this presentation. There are no special equipment or software required to run or at least get started with a diary study. And you can always start with a small sample, so the cost is relatively low for this particular method. The third qualitative method we're going to look at today is user feedback. And here is one example, as you see, like a website that has a flag on the side, and then when user click on that, there's this form that they can fill out to provide more open-ended feedback here. So user feedback, it is a more passive approach. So it relies on the user to self-identify. So it's a self-selected sample of users, and they will provide feedback on their own terms. The key is here is that we want to provide an easily identifiable channel for users to provide such feedback, and also leave these feedback questions more open-ended, similar to interviews. And commonly seen feedback channels are prompts on the website, but not intrusive and not intercept, because that's another method we'll be covering later in this webinar. A contact us form, a link in an email, outreach email, or sometimes even an on-site at your conference. We can have a form there for people who are interested in providing feedback to us. These kind of passive research methods can gather a large amount of sample over time. It's low maintenance. And an added benefit is that if the feedback channel is provided in the context when users are performing the task or things we're interested in, it also allows us to gain that particular insight for the contextual insights. There might be some cost associated with it, such as the software that you need to purchase or the platform integration that you need to build to implement those things on your site or in your app. But overall, it's still not too expensive to have it set up, and once it's set up, it can run and gather data for a very long time. So now, getting into the fun part. This is one of my favorite usability or research method to conduct is moderated usability study, also sometimes referred to as user testing. But really, we're not testing the users. We're testing the usability of the system. So I prefer usability study, but this is just more of a personal preferences here. And as you see here, for a qualitative method, we're using the moderated study. There's also the unmoderated study method, which we'll be covering in the next session for more of the data-driven and the quantitative approach. So these moderated usability studies can be done with existing or prospective users. And first of all, these studies can be done in person or remotely via screen sharing software. And in these studies, a designer or researcher usually would ask a participant to perform tasks, usually using one or more, like a sequence of interfaces or screens. And when the participants are going through these tasks, the researcher will observe their behavior and listen and document their feedback. We recommend doing these in person whenever possible, because if it's in person, then we get the chance to really read the user's body language and recognize and if any appropriate time for follow-up, for probing questions while we're in the room, because sometimes they will be silent, and if it's just silent over the phone where we can't see them, we may not know like what's going on. But if it's silent when we're with them there in person, we may see that they're thinking, there's some like body gestures, and all the subtle things are things that we notice as researchers and designers that will inform our decisions down the road. And it can also be beneficial for the product team to see the actual user interact with their designs in real life rather than watching them or listening them over the phone. And these qualitative studies focus on collecting insights, findings, and anecdotes about how people use the product or service, and it is best for discovering problems in user experience, UX. These type of studies are direct, quick, and can be used to test both current product and future designs. At Adage, we always recommend and help our clients to design and conduct usability studies throughout the project cycle, from the initial discovery to validating the final design. If you have the right resources in your organization already, it's really not that difficult to set up a study with a smaller sample, just as a starting point. The most challenging and time-consuming piece is probably recruitment, meaning finding the participant for these studies. And even that, there are companies out there that can help us recruit, help us carry the burden. And if really you just want to get a taste and not invest too much money in upfront, I recommend that, and to a lot of my clients, and we can start these with people you already have relationship with, say volunteers, staff members, or their family members, conference attendees if you have a gathering coming up. So those are great opportunity to conduct these moderated usability studies. And then this is a method, the one we're going to do next is another interesting one. This one is more of a hybrid, depending on how it is conducted and analyzed. As you can see here, it's a survey presented to participants after they viewed different visual design alternatives, and they are asked to pick which words they associate with each design. Here's one of the ways to visualize and analyze the result is by using a word cloud, and you can see clearly which word has a stronger association versus the others. So this is called a desirability study, and this study can be done with current and prospective users. So you may ask, what is desirability? And what's the difference between desirability and usability? Because we talked about usability in the study in the previous method. Well, usability focuses more on the fundamentals of user being able to complete a task. Desirability provides them with an enjoyable experience as they're doing so. So the key of this study method is a controlled set of vocabulary, as you see in that survey, for participants to react with. So really, this is getting into the kind of the sentiment, the feeling of it, versus just whether it's usable, is functional, and the flow of that. And like I said, it focuses more on the look and feel, the visual appeal of, and the wow, the compelling factor of your design and or proposal, and can be accomplished with a moderate budget. One thing not to forget when we budget for any type of user research is compensation or incentive. So a small gift or some sort usually would boost sign-up rates and get people more engaged. With a large sample, the cost may go up slightly. So that's always we want to keep that in mind. So those are the couple that we would like to show with you guys when it comes to gathering the stories. The next we're going to dive into the numbers. Similar to the story piece, we're only going to cover a few of them today during our time together. These methods, we tend to view them as they do a way better job answering questions like how many, how much, these type of questions that we want to learn about our members or users at large. So in this section, we're going to go through A/B testing, Clickstream analysis, intercept surveys, and unmoderated usability studies. So first, A/B testing. So in an A/B testing study, we show different users variations of designs and record their performance. It could be click-through. The performance could be like click-through rates, the dollar amount purchased, time spent on the site, and then other measurement that may tie into our organization's KPIs. So here's just a quick example. We see the two different versions. There are the call to actions here, and then we record the results over time, and one is a clear winner. So B, the challenger, has a higher conversion rate here. So A/B testing is a method that will test different designs on the site, and it relies on randomly assigning group of users to interact with each of the different alternatives and then measuring the effect. It is most effective in generating supporting evidence to refine a design decision, and also to continue to iterate on an ongoing basis. A lot of the content management systems out there in CMS or other email marketing systems already support some sort of A/B testing. So if you haven't done this, you might want to take a look at the systems and tools you already have access to and see if you can do this already. All you really need to do is to create 2 or more designs and go test it. Sometimes we're not sure which one will do better, and this really is a very quick and easy way to test it out. But one thing I want to point out is that this type of testing lacks behavioral insights. So why do users favor A or B? It's hard to answer that. So sometimes these type of method alone cannot fully address the kind of the fundamental, like the reason, the foundational piece, the driver, the root cause of some of these behaviors. So the cost associated with this type of research is mainly the platform we need to support it. Again, as I mentioned, you might already have it, so then there's no additional cost for it. But if you don't have access to this, you may want to look into some platforms or plugins that will help us perform these types of A/B testing. Another thing to point out is the difference between A/B testing and MVT, so multivariate testing, which is another way of testing designs. So the multivariate testing focuses on single variables. So we're only changing the size, only changing the color or the copy. Whereas A/B testing, as we walk through, focuses on more of an overall appeal, the overall performance, which may combine multiple variants, but we're only testing A, B, or A, B, and C. So without going too much into the details today, and because we have many other methods to go through, one thing to remember is that if you are looking more to make tweaks or incremental changes, use the multivariate testing, so you can have a tight control over one or two variables and really understand which combination or which one works better, versus use A/B testing for more radical design or redesigns when more variables are involved, and sometimes it just really requires a way large sample, and it just becomes hard to manage if we use the multivariate testing method. So A/B testing for more radical changes where a lot of things are changing or completely different approaches. The next one tool that we want to walk through is called Clickstream analysis. This is another very useful quantitative research method, and there are many other platforms and tools that offer support for these type of analysis. So here are a few, Mouseflow, Hotjar, Crazy Egg, Lucky Orange, and our favorite, Google Analytics. So Clickstreams, here's an example where it's like in a heat map format where it shows where user clicks, which area has higher click, which area has lower click. It not only shows the click, but also sometimes we'll use the flow, like what's the journey user goes through from page A to page B, maybe back to page A. Like how do we analyze those type of behavior once it's documented? So there's really a lot of facets within the Clickstream analysis. But it's really useful, especially when when we can gather these data with our current existing users to understand their behaviors, and it focuses on analyzing the recording of screens that user clicks and perform their tasks, and the data points really help us paint a picture of how users interact with our site. Very similar to A/B testing, this method answers how many type of questions, but lacks support on the whys. However, when platforms are properly set up, data can be gathered over a long period of time, which will help us monitor performance over the time and prompt design updates. Google Analytics is a place to start gathering these type of data and start analyzing your users' behavior, how they interact with your site. And if you're interested in some of the other tools, some of them will have free trials or limited features for you to access if you don't want to pay. But to access some of the full features and the cool analytical tools, you may want to budget for some subscriptions. It depends on your budget and organization's need. But this will help us gather a large amount of samples and really help paint the picture of the user's journey. The next research method is called intercept surveys. This is probably also not foreign to most of us, fairly common. You probably have experienced it yourself when you shop online or trying out new apps. So for a pop-up survey, or an app and ask you to rate their experience. So these type of surveys, it may look very familiar to the user feedback, which we talked about in the qualitative method. The main difference here is that intercept survey is triggered while users are using the site or app, and it kind of stops or interrupts the flow a little bit, compared to user feedback, which will let the user drive and let them initiate the feedback process. The other main difference is that these type of intercept surveys are usually very short, and they are also usually not open-ended. So as you see in the previous example, it's just yes or no, helpful or not, a rating 1 to 5 stars. Sometimes it can be followed by some sort of user feedback with more open-ended questions, but at least this initial prompt usually is very short and brief to just to reduce the barriers for entry for people to participate. And this type of survey usually sometimes will require software platform integrations. But once it's set up, it usually is easy to monitor on an ongoing basis to gather a very large sample of data over time. Again, very useful to just kind of put it out there and passively gather data and just periodically come back and take a look and see how things are going and performing. And the cost here, again, relatively low. Might need to invest in some of the tools and platforms. Another type of usability study, compared to the moderated one that we talked about in the qualitative method, is this unmoderated usability study. This one can be designed to be more quantitative. And here's one example on usertesting.com where a participant is going through an automated script and answering questions, talking out loud while being recorded. These studies can be done with existing or prospective users. These unmoderated usability studies usually would use a specialized research tool to capture participants' behavior, sometimes via recording, sometimes via survey. In these studies, participants also are usually given a goal or task to complete within a given scenario to complete such goals. And usually it's tested on a live site, a high fidelity prototype. So some of the things that we've tested in the past are, for example, signing up for membership or registering for an event, buying a book, see how the design or the current site are performing. These studies work best for evaluating live site and app, as I mentioned. Sorry, just Clicker. All right, here, Clicker is back. Great. And that is we've used unmoderated studies to test design proposals to get so that we can continue to revise and iterate. And when designing the task to test, we always recommend to lean towards those ones that don't require a lot of imagination from participants because it's unmoderated, and so there's no researchers there to facilitate or address any questions if it comes up. The cost of this type of study is relatively low to moderate. To conduct this type of research, first, we need to decide on the task, and then we prepare the script and set up the test in the software of choice. Many testing tools offer subscriptions or per test plans. Recruitment facilitation are also available in some of these tools, for example, usertesting.com, which we used in the past before, where the tool will let you specify the specific demographic that you're looking for, or sometimes even use screeners to select the intended participants for your study. Tests are usually done very fast, and they can run across a very large sample. That's why the budget really fluctuates a little bit depending on your tool and the model, subscription model that you, and also the sample base that you're looking at. And one of the benefits of unmoderated tests is that it allows for cross time zone studies. So if your organization has a global reach or global audience, sometimes it will be challenging to do moderated studies. If you have a lot of tests running, say, if we're based in the US, if you're running tests in Asia or in Australia, sometimes even in Europe, it's hard to coordinate. So these types of unmoderated tests really comes into handy in those scenarios. So we only walk through a few of the most common methods in today's webinar, and there are a lot more, and depending on your organization's need, your user and your member base, the timeline of the project and the budget. There's always a method that I believe there's always a method that will help you build empathy and gain audience insights. You can mix and match or use one to carry through the entire project, like some of those long duration methods that we walked through today. And if you look at some examples that we talk about today, if we kind of try to paint the picture across a project's life cycle, you can start the discovery and visioning process by conducting user interviews, doing diary studies, review existing user feedbacks, to gain insight, help us ideate, come up with ideas, define a strategy. And then in the design and development cycle, here at Adage, we run in agile sprints, but whichever cycle that you implement, you use in your organization, you can always use moderated usability testing, desirability studies, use these type of research to verify the usability and desirability of your new design or updates, either whether a website, offering, a new membership model, a completely new business model, anything that touches a user's life. And after you've launched these new offerings, new website, app, or any other things you're experimenting with, you can always build in the intercept surveys and provide those user feedback loops, as well as conducting moderated usability studies, clickstream analysis to help us monitor the ongoing performance and plan for the ongoing iterations and adjustments as we continue on through the life cycle of the project.
Thanks, Riju. So what's next? Kind of where do we get started? We go back, excuse me, there are three main steps to kind of get going. And the first one is to conduct an internal or third-party audit of current or available audience research. So you got to understand what you have, and that leads us to the second piece, which is understanding the gaps or where are the missing pieces that you have to fill in with the stuff that you have currently. Finally, you have to develop a plan, and the plan has to address the gaps. Everybody's going to have gaps, but we have to kind of strategize and put together a plan to close those down. And a couple of things to keep in mind here, things like what kind of budget's available, because as Riju just went through several different examples of various, costs or effort levels. Like he said, there are answers for everybody, but you have to understand what kind of budget's there and what are you trying to get done. You have to understand if there's an internal expertise or if you have to go out to a third party to do this. You really have to understand where your users are, or can we get a hold of them? How do we get in touch with them? Just understanding your users and their availability is something that you have to keep in mind. And then Riju touched on this too, but when's your next conference? Conferences are a great place to gather lots of research. Since there's so many users, the same place, the same time, and you can really aggregate a lot of your work into the few days that you're going to be on site at your annual conference. So to kind of close things out, we have a couple client examples. The first one, and I'll go pretty quickly so we have time for questions, but the first is a client of ours where we started off using some of the activities Riju just talked about, specifically interviews and field studies. And one of the things we heard is the annual conference is great. It's great for networking opportunities, but there was a huge frustration with how long it takes to check in. And I put together this little slide for you. People standing in line for over an hour was a major frustration and a pain point for most attendees. So we saw the lines ourselves when we did the field studies for this client, and we knew that was an area to address. And so an example user story would be, as a conference attendee, I need to be able to check in on my mobile device to avoid standing in line. And we developed a solution that allowed attendees to check in on their computer or their phone, and the next year the line looked a little bit more like this. The next client example is a real estate investment association that we work with, where we held workshops, we did technical assessments, and learned that really the biggest member benefit was the treasure trove of data that their organization had, that the members used to make investment decisions. The one problem was that they came in massive spreadsheets. They were very difficult to navigate and find the information that was needed. So an example user story for this is, as a user, I want to filter data in a meaningful way so that I can get the information I'm looking for. And what we developed was an interactive tool that allowed members to very easily create reports and dashboards that deliver that value, interactive maps, and the ability to kind of filter and use facets to spit out the reports that were meaningful to that specific member. The last one I'll talk about is a client where we worked through interviews and workshops, did a deep dive into their analytics, and found that there were over a dozen different places where valuable content lived on their website. And users were really frustrated with all the disparate systems when they were looking for information. And I love this quote. If I narrow my search for a brown 2-inch heel knee-high boot from Macy's, I should be able to search for information in the same degree on the website and on my phone. So users just wanted to search for content in one place and filter results to find what they wanted in just a couple of clicks. Solution that we created for this client is a robust search platform that pulled content from over a dozen sites into one interface, one place, where you could find the information quickly and at the touch of your fingers on your phone as well. Hugely helpful to the audience. So to kind of wrap things up, I will end with a quote from Jeff Bezos, which is similar to the Steve Jobs quote from earlier, but we're not competitor obsessed, we're customer obsessed. We start with the customer, we work backwards. So the message here is that you need to give the customer what they want, and it starts with being obsessed with the customer experience in order to empathize and achieve that goal. So with that, we will turn it over to some questions. The first one that we had is, how many interviews is enough?
Right. That's a question we get most of the time. I'm glad someone brought that up. So it's a really tough question. It kind of depends on the scope and how many different user groups that we're examining or interested in. But generally speaking, we usually say starting with at least 5 representative users per group, focus on one area of interest. And with 5, that's kind of the magic number in the user research field, is that you can uncover the majority of the pain points for that particular user group in that particular scenario. So, and that's for the interviews, that 5 number also applies to other research methods, say the moderative usability testing. When we do it here at Adage, we also recommend usually start with 5 users to begin with. But just one thing to remember, that if we want to start with 5, you probably want to recruit at least like 7, 8 people or have their name on the list, because our experience that usually there's like 20% to 40% no-show rate for these type of user studies. That's why also sometimes those incentives matters. A gift card, a coupon, or some kind of a reward will help a long way in getting people participating in our research.
All right. The next one we have here is, when should I plan for usability testing?
So usability testing, I think that's also a very good question. And as we briefly touched on towards the end of the presentation, these testings can be performed throughout the life cycle. But I would say that if we want to get really the most kind of the impacts of our investment, our experience is that at the very beginning, while we're still kind of exploring the different ideas, uncovering pain points, truly understanding what's the current landscape, like how users are thinking about our current offerings. That's a great time to do the moderative usability testing, because that will help give us insights into those like behavior insights. While in the towards the mid cycle of the project, when we have designs that's high fidelity that we can have people react to, that's a great time to conduct some of those unmoderated usability testing, where we can get quick and fast feedback, how people are reacting to the different designs, just to give us a sense of whether we are on track or off track, whether our hypothesis is correct or not, or whether we need to adjust course.
Okay, we have another one from the audience. Is a member engagement survey enough, or should we be conducting other studies to gain more insight about who our members are?
I'd say that it's without seeing what our survey looks like, it's a really hard question to answer. And we've seen various versions of membership engagement survey from just the associations that we work with. Some of them are very comprehensive and systematic, which provides a great starting point for us to kind of get insights into the membership, the sentiment, understand our audience base. While some other organizations, it's really brief and it's hard to kind of parse through the data. But I'd say if you are already doing those engagement survey, it's a really good starting point. What I would recommend is that just to see, does that help you answer the questions that you want to answer? Like, when we talk about at the very beginning, all these research methods is really meant to help us answer questions. How many, how much? If you still have those questions, you might want to pick some of those quantitative methods that we walked through. And if your question is more about whys and hows, and those aren't answered, or you don't think you are getting a clear picture or getting enough support from your membership engagement survey, then it's probably a good idea to perform some of the qualitative testing research method that we mentioned today. And these really should be ongoing. And we always recommend to do these kind of small and increments rather than waiting for a couple years and do a complete overhaul.
Yeah, I think what we always want to know, if we have that kind of like a member engagement survey ready, and we have it at the beginning of a project, it's a great place to start, but we definitely would advocate for doing more than just that, and really sitting down and digging a little deeper and letting users or members talk through some of their pain points, because you might not get it in a survey and it's not a conversation. So we have another question. We have a couple minutes left here. Do certain methods work better for those different user groups, like active, ghost, etc.?
Yeah, I'd say all of these methods should work and will work across the user groups, but certainly there's different challenges associated with some of. I think I pointed out briefly in one of the methods, like recruitment is really challenging to some of these, and it's a common theme across all the research, because if we can't recruit the right candidate, it just the results from those. We don't want to fool ourselves and just like telling ourselves lies, right? Because then if we can't get the right participant, we can't get the right stories or the right data. So if we're looking at the easy group here are those active members, because they are on our website. So Clickstream analysis, A/B testing, a lot of the participants, the random selected will be the active members. Like the moderated testing, we could have the script written and send out to our member base. So usually the active members are the most likely to respond. They're also easy to recruit in interviews and moderated studies. For those ghost members and the other type, I'd say those are a little bit challenging when it comes to recruiting. And usually we'll see that for those type of members, it is most helpful to start with some sort of a qualitative research method, just to get us, because we don't know much about them. And a lot of the questions we want to answer is about the why. So why are they ghosts, right? Why don't they know about us? Why do they drop out? Why don't they engage with us? So for these type of membership member types, I recommend starting with the qualitative method, and interviews always a good part. Interview, diary study, and shadowing, which is something we didn't go into detail today. Those will be the three methods that tends to work best as a starting point with these low engagement members.
Okay, we got time for one more. You're gonna have to give a quick answer here, Riju, but how does GDPR affect an association's ability to conduct research?
Right, that's a great question. So there are certainly a lot of concerns on what of data and then data security online, especially. So that is why so as I mentioned, a lot of these tools and platforms are built in these methods. Let's say in the surveys, Intercept are building from those platforms. and we could look into those platforms, like their support for the GDPR. A lot of the times, like the platforms is very widely used, and they would take initiative to provide these kind of security and measures for the data. And if we're conducting our own research, we just need to do the best practices. So, for example, following, we always ask users for consent for any recordings, very clearly with disclaimers, and ask users to sign that before we conduct any of this type of research. So a lot of this really, will involve our internal legal and other department. So it's more of on a case by case, but certainly something to keep in mind.
So thank you again for everybody for joining us. Thank you to Emily and our community for allowing us and letting us host. And until next time, we appreciate it and hope to talk to you soon.